For those looking for a liberatory martial arts learning approach and curriculum, we've created Liberation Martial Arts. It doesn't just teach you martial arts, it's also a radical and alternative approach to learning. Thanks to Noel, Oscar, LL Muser, and Emily for signing up. Sign up for Liberation Martial Arts at the Southpaw Pod Patreon, or support us by signing up for one of our other tiers, or by becoming a sponsor. This will give you access to bonus content, transcripts, and uncut versions of our shows without breaks or interruptions. Sponsors also get a monthly training session with me. If you prefer to support others, your sponsorship can go to the training of an organizer instead. There's also ways to make one-time contributions. Find all our links at southpawpod.com. This episode was recorded on November 28th, 2024. This is Southpaw. I'm your host, Sam. Today I have a very special guest. Justin, can you introduce yourself?
Sure. My name is Justin. I am the host of the podcast, The Anti-Empire Project. We have a podcast with multiple series, including the Civilizations series of world history. And we have ongoing reports, mostly these days, mostly on Palestine and the Gaza War on YouTube, as well as on the audio through something we call the Anti-Empire Report, which we also cover Pakistan once in a while, Latin America once in a while, basically anything anti-imperialist we eventually get to. And I have a Substack, justinpodur.substack.com, where I write about the same topics, and we just do these topics everywhere.
And for listeners who don't know you, can you tell us about your positionality as far as where you live, where you grew up, where your family is from, what you do?
Oh, sure. Okay. I grew up in Toronto, in one of the suburbs of Toronto called Mississauga, which is pretty well known probably throughout all of Canada as being a very multicultural suburb of Toronto. I think something like 50% of the people in Toronto are born outside of Canada. So it's notable even to people from diverse cities like in the States, how multicultural Toronto is and how multicultural Mississauga is. My parents were born in Kerala, which is the state in South India that has, it's kind of like known as the Cuba of India, because it has, relatively low wealth indices, but relatively high education and health indices. They often elect communist governments at the state level. And right now there's one, actually. And that's responsible for a lot of the progressive or egalitarian legislation that they have. But on the other hand, there's a lot of problems too, where a lot of people from Kerala, they're called Malayalis, and they go abroad because they seek job opportunities. They send money back. And so there's a big diaspora of Malayalis all over the Persian Gulf and in Canada and the US. So that's my background. As far as what I do now, I'm a professor actually, but so I teach environmental management, and that's my job. And I write books, and I write articles on various topics. I used to be more active in science. I used to publish in scientific journals in forestry specifically, but I've moved more and more to more political writing. Oh, and I'm also a student of martial arts. Was that your actual question?
No, but it is worth mentioning Kerala has one of the richest and oldest martial art histories. I don't know if that influenced your interest in martial arts at all.
No, I did. I did study the Kerala martial art of Kalaripayat for 10 years. And so, yeah, it was a big part of my life.
So you mentioned some of your writing. So for listeners, I'll break it down. Justin, as a prolific writer, whether as an early online political blogger to historical and political books, or even works of fiction, he writes the hard stuff. I feel like nonfiction is easy. I feel like fiction is when you actually need to know how to write.
Well, if you want people to read
Yes,
it.
yes. Because nonfiction, even if you're not a great writer, they might read it anyway just because of the subject matter.
They need the information, yeah.
And then you have the Anti Empire Project, and you got into it, right? You're also a martial artist. And the last time I had you on was to help me analyze UFC 278. And that's why I wanted to talk to you because you are that niche within a niche that represents our listenership. So, how did you get into politics?
Oh, that's an interesting question. Um, I think as a young teenager, I was about 13, 14 when the Gulf War started. So the attack on Iraq, the United States war on Iraq, and I saw, CNN kind of rose during that time, and they were showing bomb cameras of blowing up targets in Iraq, and they were showing Saddam Hussein as the bad guy, and George Bush was on TV, and he was talking about the New World Order, and I don't know. I don't know if I'm like rewriting my own history, but the way I remember it was that I was pretty horrified by it all, and I didn't really believe uh, the what I was seeing. So I guess that was like when I started thinking about stuff. So as listeners of my show might know, I had a really good high school history teacher, Mr. Power, and he also we kind of became friends. He had a little club where we played games. Diplomacy was a game we played a lot in the portable after school. There were a group of kids, and we played these different games. But diplomacy was a game that involved knowing a lot of world history, to enjoy it. And his history class was great. You know, and as he's my the reason I say people know is because he's my co-host of the history podcast that I do. So I kind of let him do his thing and the way that he taught his class, but I also try to add like the rest of the world, because the class that he taught was modern Western civilization, and so I wanted to include Eastern and Southern civilization to that, and indigenous civilizations to that picture. And he was always aware of that. But anyway, so I had a really good teacher in high school. I had my father was pretty political too. My mom, because they're from Kerala. When I when I went to a Catholic school and I read the Bible around that age, I just took the Bible off my parents' shelf and read it over the course of, I don't know, a couple of months. I read parts of it every night, and that was also kind of horrifying to me. I'm sorry with apologies to our religious friends, but the stuff in the Bible that I read was like, oh, this is really strange stuff.
You went the opposite direction of Jordan Peterson.
I guess so.
He's like, oh, such beautiful writing. And you're like, man, this ain't all that.
Just like why God decides to punish people, and the kinds of things that God is punishing people for, and the specifics of the rules that are presented. It was, for me, it was, and so I was like, I like declared to my mother, I was like, Mom, I think I'm an atheist now. And she was like, so you don't believe in God anymore? And I was like, no, I don't think I believe in God anymore. And she was like, okay, so you're a communist. and then she was like, my dad was a her dad died, relatively young, like I was 2 years old. So she was like, my dad was a big communist. He was a big communist. So
I want to interject here for listeners, because for a lot of the world, if you're an atheist, you're a communist.
Yeah.
They're like one and the same. Whereas I think in the West, they think of these things as different.
Yes.
But why I need to bring attention to that is also because for a lot of the world, right? Like for the US, they don't like communism because of its economic system, but a lot of the other world, especially because of colonialism, they don't like communism because it is godless, right? It is atheist.
Yeah.
A lot of Koreans, they don't hate North Korea or the DPRK or communism because of its political system or economic system. They hate it because they think they're atheists, right? So that's something I think people from non European cultures know, but sometimes forget that the West doesn't know that. And the West, that's information they don't know.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And so by the time I was like 17, 18, I would kind of gravitated to learning more about India. So I read Gandhi's books and Nehru's books and like the Indian nationalists. And that was, that was interesting. And my project, my, my high school history final project, my paper that I wrote, I had to write about some great in history. So Mr. Power asked us to write about either, Peter the Great or Alexander, not Alexander the Great. It had to be like Catherine the Great or Peter the Great or somebody great, the in modern history, and then like ask the question of whether they were great or not. And I was always like attracted to global South kinds of figures, so I wrote my paper on Chairman Mao from China. So I was already into like Chinese history and Chinese communism and I wrote that paper. And first year university, I was just kind of wandering the bookshelves of the library at the University of Toronto, and I kind of discovered Noam Chomsky's books. So it was like Deterring Democracy, and I remember seeing that on the shelf, and I was like, that's a weird thing to do, Deterring Democracy. And I took the book out and I was sitting in the library and reading it until really late. And I went home. I was living with my parents at home at the time, and it was a long commute, but I stayed at school really late reading that book and then came home really late and then went and read like everything to do with Chomsky. And then in the 90s, I kind of, with the internet and everything getting going, I found ZNet. And then I started working at ZNet. And so that was kind of like my long initiation into this kind of political journalistic work, I guess.
So, what drew you to martial arts or kept bringing you back to martial arts? And do you remember what was happening in the world during those times as far as like political forces that were in play?
Martial arts was a bit earlier. So, I was like a lot of kids, I was bullied in school, and school was pretty rough, and my dad was like, you're gonna do martial arts. And so he put me in, guess which martial arts, Sam?
Not taekwondo.
Taekwondo.
The stereotype.
Yeah. So I was in Taekwondo for like 3 years, I think. Maybe I was 12, 13, 14, 15, maybe 4 years of Taekwondo. I broke boards. I learned all the kicks. I learned all the forms. I learned how to count to 10 in Korean. Lots of push-ups, lots of stretching. Whatever the efficacy or otherwise of Taekwondo, and I've come around on a lot of it. Well, we can talk more about that, but like certainly it was really good for like hip mobility and a lot of those kinds of things that I really appreciate having now at my age. So yeah, Taekwondo was the first one, and then I didn't do anything for a while, and then I did some Filipino martial arts for a little bit, and then I joined a Jeet Kune Do school for years. Well, actually, Jeet Kune Do was after Kalari. So Kalari was from 2000 to 2010, and then Jeet Kune Do. And then I basically, there's like a pipeline. I think a lot of people follow this pipeline, like Taekwondo to Jeet Kune Do to BJJ. So I was on this pipeline. And so, but BJJ was really hard for me. It was really hard on my body. It was really competitive. And so I kept going in and out, and I'm still a white belt in BJJ, but I've done it. I've been doing it for many, 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 many years. And I do some judo. I did some judo in university too. I have an orange belt in judo. I do that once in a while.
And so this is kind of this continuing relationship, right? It was not one thing. I think with Taekwondo, that is the one people start in, but it's like understood you're not supposed to keep doing it,
Yeah,
right?
exactly.
Like even your parents don't want you to do it. They're like, okay, you did this to develop something, you developed that thing. Now Taekwondo is supposed to supercharge your education because now you have self discipline. Go do homework now, right? They tell you it's about bullying and self defense, but the parents are really putting you in there because they keep hearing this Taekwondo will teach you self discipline
Obedience.
and will help the kids study more. And they're like, okay, you do this for a little bit and then we're going to just have you study, right? But anyway, so you kept coming back to martial arts. So it's kind of like epochs in your life, right? So were you thinking about politics also during these times?
No, it sort of feels like, and I don't know, I don't know if it's true, but it sort of feels like it was more like a break for me from working. So whenever I was like the active years of Taekwondo were before I got really political. When I was working at Z, I was doing some quality. I think that's what I was doing most of the time. It really is kind of like a leisure, I think, for me, and like a place to dissipate energy that I'm not able to dissipate because I'm frustrated through politics. It's just, yeah, I think it's always been an aspect of life that's like a little bit different. I don't know. I don't know if you have this, but it's like for me, political work is like, I guess, primary, and then there's like these different aspects of life. Even when I was much more active as a scientist, it was always like science was like a break. Science was like something fun and more whimsical almost than like deadly serious politics. And like martial arts is also fun. We've talked about that when you came to my show. Martial arts is like something fun and challenging, and like it's a challenge for your mind, it's a challenge for your body.
It was providing something else.
Yeah, yeah. And like I remember there were times when I was in Jeet Kune Do, and our Jeet Kune Do gym is great, and the instructor is a really good friend, and they have these kind of throwdowns, which is like a really low stakes chance for people to test their skills and have these low like contact fights with other people and whatever discipline you want. And I had been working on a political campaign. It was like 2013. I'll spare you the details, but I was super 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 busy, like 24 hours a day for 2 months, and or 50 days 51 days to be precise. And like in the middle of that there was a throwdown, and I went to the throwdown, and my instructor was like, I think it's good to see you here. He's like, I know what you've been working on, like I've seen what you've been doing, and you know it's just it's nice to see you. And I went and I did some fights, and then I went home, and I went back to work.
So you've done various martial arts. A lot of them are very different. Did the skills you developed in one art ever transfer over to the next? Like, did you keep carrying skills over and over, or was it like starting all over again?
I think it was more like starting all over again. I have not had an experience of very much transfer. Yeah, honestly, even between judo and BJJ, it's quite strange. But like, I'll even like randori newaza judo. So you're like ground fighting in judo, and then the same things won't work in a BJJ match, or vice versa, or like no gi wrestling. Like I used to do a bunch of wrestling classes, no gi wrestling classes, and the wrestling class doesn't even necessarily transfer to no gi BJJ. So no, it really is like just resetting. And I don't know. I think for me, I like that. I like just being a beginner. Sometimes I wonder like if I had been more disciplined and gotten my belts, in judo, or gotten my belts in BJJ, and I'd be a black belt and I'd be teaching now. And then I just think like, really, like teaching something else?
This actually touches upon a conversation we've had previously about even things like drilling or the way things are taught, right? You're like, even similar things don't transfer over to the other thing, right? And what I told you is, why would drilling then transfer over to sparring? Like, live sparring in judo is closer to live sparring in jujitsu. Drilling in jujitsu is not close to sparring. So why would something so distant even transfer, right? That was the case I was making. And actually, you're finding out even similar martial art activities don't donate to the next one, right? So things are very highly specific.
Yeah.
So delving deeper into martial arts, a lot of people think about training, but don't stick with it. Lots of people want to train for self-defense, but self-defense isn't a great motivator for sticking with something. And either they never start or don't stay. The people who stay are the ones who train because they like it, to your point, right? So there's lots of radicals, there's lots of radical academics, but few are interested in martial arts, let alone interested in training. Some might say, yes, training is important for some utility. But when it comes to the love and enjoyment, why isn't there the same spark as there is for you and me? Why aren't there more Justins, whether on the left or in academia?
Well, I mean, in the academy, people think of it as barbaric.
That makes clear why they'd want nothing to do with it.
Yeah. A lot of my colleagues will, they'll ride their bikes. Like lots of them like play soccer. There's a lot of academics who like physical activity, exercise, but martial arts is, yeah, like especially now with like MMA and everything, they just think that that's really brutal and macho, right? Gendered, problematic. So I think there's a lot of those kinds of things at work with why academics don't like it. Leftists, I guess there's a lot of that kind of academic bias to the leftists that I am familiar with anyway, and probably that's some of the reason why they don't like it as well. And of course, we've talked about the toxicity of martial arts culture. Like it came from these nationalist traditions. It exists now in a sort of a fascist, like the biggest martial arts in North America are BJJ and MMA, and those are basically fascist, cultures.
It's also highly individualistic, right? It's not a team sport. And that probably also doesn't attract leftists. There are, especially every time Trump is around, radicals and people on the left talk about you need to train, but it's almost like a drudgery, right?
Yeah.
None of them are talking about it as something they love. They're just like, this is something you ought to do. Just force yourself to do it, right? And it's like, a fascist trained today, so should you. And it's like, man, with that attitude, you'll never outtrain the fascists, because the fascists aren't thinking about the left. They're not training because, oh my God, a leftist might be training today. They're training because they love it. They can't get enough of it. They're just having fun, right? They don't need to motivate themselves. They just like the thing, right? So if you don't like the thing, how are you ever going to do it more than the person who likes the thing, right? So there's kind of like an attitudinal problem there.
Yeah, but like, I don't know, like academics also do things they don't like, right? Like there's a lot of the reading you do or a lot of the writing you do, you don't necessarily like it, but you do it, Where do you think discipline fits in? Like, isn't there an element of like repeating and making a habit out of doing things that you don't necessarily like doing?
Yeah. I think the first hurdle is trying it. I don't know if it's all thinking of it as just barbaric and macho. I think that's like the surface level stuff. My guess is movies. Movies is what gets regular people into it, but the fact that it is so sensationalized, it's like this fantasy, it's like such a fictional thing, right? Whereas academics are grounded in, like we talked about, nonfiction and research. So martial arts is so associated with these kind of like fanciful, like, these kind of Chinese opera type movies to these John Wick kind of stuff. So it's almost like, rather than barbaric, it's like silly. The barbaric thing is like kind of the surface level thing. That might be what they even tell themselves. But I think ultimately, I think it might be just that it's too silly.
Yeah, it could be. It could be. It could be because, yeah, it is a bit silly, isn't it? It's kind of whimsical and silly, and
you're wearing this like thing that you would never walk around in, and like it's almost like LARPing, right? But that's the fun.
yeah.
They don't get that. That is the point. That is the fun. A note to our listeners. If you love the Southpaw Project, please support us and help us get paid for our labor by financially supporting us on Patreon. This will give you access to exclusive bonus content, like transcripts, early releases of Southpaw Deep Space Nine, our fictional narrative podcast, Fighters Brew, break-free versions of our shows without interruptions like you're hearing now, bonus articles, Fighters Brew transcripts with extra content, Liberation Martial Arts Online, as well as our private chat group on Discord. You can also make one-time donations at Ko-Fi or show your solidarity by wearing our swag. You can find all pertinent links at southpawpod.com.
Yeah, and it's like you're preparing for situations that will never arise. And if they arose, they wouldn't arise like you are preparing for them.
So that's the part about sticking with it. Eventually, you just got to let that go and just do it for fun instead of like thinking about the utility of it.
Yeah, exactly. And this also happens. Like I was when I was doing Jeet Kune Do, I was in and out of jujitsu, and I figured like having better grappling would make my MMA matches and Jeet Kune Do practice better. But like when I would go to grappling classes, I would think about how to do better in the grappling class, which is not necessarily the skills that transfer. So inevitably you get drawn into whatever it is that you're doing at that time, and you'll want to get better at that skill, whatever it is. And that's not necessarily like going to make you better at the thing you originally got into it for.
Why you got in the door is not why you stay.
Yeah. And it's like even lifting weights, right? It's like, you're like, oh, I want to be stronger for judo, or I want to be stronger for wrestling because the stronger guy keeps beating me at wrestling matches. So I go and I lift weights, but like really, like I like lifting weights, right? And then I start like, oh, like I could get, look at my numbers are going up on my squat and my numbers are going up on my bench press. And then you're doing it to get a better number on your bench press. So, and that's fine, right? Like there's nothing wrong with any of that.
You've told me you've thought a lot about martial arts and politics, but never had the platform to really discuss it.
Here we are.
Probably the only radical platform to discuss it is probably the only appropriate place to discuss it. So what are some of your observations that you've had that you've been mulling over?
Well, like historically, right? So Kalari Payat, there's a whole history. Like my Kalari teacher was told by Chinese people that they thought that there was a Chinese monk who learned from India and brought that back to the Shaolin, but that might not, who knows, right? So the thought that I had, like Kalari Payat is interesting because it's like you do it in a dirt pit, like it's dug out. And then Indian wrestling, which I did a little bit of too in 2013, is also in a sand pit. And like there's like part of the warm up is like dragging a kind of rake over the sand pit, which is like a really heavy, deliberately heavy rake because it's like a sledding exercise. You've probably seen stuff like this.
This sounds similar to Korean shirim too.
Is it? Okay. I mean, yeah.
There's a whole raking process with the sand too.
Yeah. So you're raking the sand, and then, like the way that they do Indian wrestling training is like you do squats, right? You do the Hindu squats, you do the burpees, you do the Hindu push-ups. Then you do a little bit of wrestling. Then you go and do some squats. You climb a rope. Like it's a very informal process. Kalari Payat is a little more formal, but it's sort of like everybody's doing the form together, and you kind of start with the basic forms, and then you get to more and more advanced forms, and you drop out. As the forms get more advanced, you basically drop out, and your part of the class is over, and then the more advanced students stay to the end, and then some of them are there doing sword and shield and whipping swords and stuff at the very hours later after everybody else, all the kids are gone. But like I didn't really understand, because every martial art is for a specific social application, etc. And Kalari Payat I understand now is like basically they were training champions. So they were like warrior castes, and they were training to be like champions where, you know, our champion from our community will fight your champion from your community to resolve some dispute, or you have a dispute with someone and you'll get one of these champions from this colony and they'll get a champion, and then they fight, and then the fight decides who, you know, pays who, or who says sorry. Whatever. And like, so it's that again, like you were saying, it's an individual combat. The assumption is the other person is trained more or less the same as you. You have the same weapon. Maybe, you know, you choose, they know several different weapons, and you, whatever you choose, the other guy chooses to, you know, and, and training takes so long that you probably don't want to fight to the death because it takes so long to train somebody up to that level. And then, you know, and then like Taekwondo, like you look back at Taekwondo and it's like a nationalist project of Korea, of South Korea. And so it's like, here I am in Mississauga practicing like the 4-corner punch sequence, which is based on the Korean flag, which I only learned later. And karate, right? Like karate from Japan, originally from Okinawa, and they brought in boxing because the emperor apparently was impressed with some boxing display. And so all of these like pure arts and forms from these countries are actually like these mixes and blends. And I have a theory that like Indian wrestling, like catch can wrestling comes from Britain, right? Britain in like the mid 19th century, but it's like Britain in the mid 19th century had been in India for about 100 years. So I suspect, I mean, everybody wrestles. You've pointed this out, but like I suspect there's a lot of Indian wrestling and catch wrestling, and a lot of catch wrestling and Indian wrestling. And so these ancient traditions of wrestling and Greco-Roman wrestling, it was invented by a Frenchman. It was invented by a Frenchman in the 19th century, and he called it Greco-Roman.
That's happening again now, right? With HEMA, historical European martial arts, where it's always kind of like trying to restore some kind of old Western thing, reclaim the Western past, its great legacy, its origins, its past greatness.
Yeah. You're getting it out of these books, and like you have pictures from books.
But seems like the theme you're drawing is how there's the mythology of all these different martial arts, and that's what you kind of buy into when you get in there. And then when you actually study it, you're like, oh, this isn't the actual history, right?
Yeah.
We're calling it mythology now, but we just thought this is like the origin. You know, it's like the Bible. Now we don't take it as a history book, but when you're first introduced to it, you think it is a history book. And it's like, as a martial artist, you're like a fundamentalist Christian where you're like, oh, the origin stories, this is all history. This is all true. It's like,
Yeah.
We have to take it as literal truth, right? And then only later do we realize it's all mythology. It's all made up. A lot of this is like recent. It's kind of like inventing traditional martial arts.
Exactly.
Kind of like how Christianity, the Bible, kind of invented like its own world history.
Yeah, that's right. All this invented history, most of it from the 19th century, most of it for like specific nationalist sport projects. And then, you know, so there's the propaganda. So like as somebody who studied Chomsky so much and was such a Chomskyite for most of my life, the idea of like contrasting the propaganda of the martial arts to the reality and to the actual history is a big part of it. But then like when you read Marx and you think of like the social basis, the social materialist basis for any activity and the means of the mode of production of the martial arts, and like what kind of class and caste society it's embedded in, right? Like everybody's so into the samurai and their sword fighting, but like the samurai is basically a caste system. It's like it's a social status. It's a class. It's a caste, and their privilege is the ownership of swords. And so the whole martial arts of the samurai is basically the enforcement of caste rule through caste violence against people who don't have the swords. So yeah, that's the kind of direction of the thoughts. But like, what's cool, what's fascinating in all this is how much you can learn about a society by investigating their martial arts and their martial traditions, and they always have some.
Something you've talked about to me is the contradiction of an instructor being reactionary, but then also genuinely caring about their students and their development, right?
Yeah, yeah. I guess for me, that is human nature. It's just the contradictions of human nature. But like, I'd like to ask you your thoughts because part of our discussion when you came on my show was like the idea that there is a way to teach or like a pedagogical approach that is more or less reactionary. And I think that's true. But I also think that the kind of you don't necessarily have to be a good person to have a good teaching approach or to be a good teacher and vice versa. Like if you're a bad teacher, you could be a good person, you could be a good teacher and a good person, you could be a bad person and a bad teacher. But the question would be, in your encounters in martial arts, do you see a more liberatory approach correlating with better politics, or do you see them as kind of independent axes?
I think it's just really easy to be a bad teacher.
Yes.
Good people, bad people can be bad teachers.
Yeah.
That's like the easier thing to do, right?
Yeah.
Being good at teaching the thing is harder than being good at the thing
Yeah.
because you could be good at the thing and not even know why or how you're good at it. And whether I think it's possible for like somebody who's a bad person to be a good teacher, like in the past, I might have said yes, but like today, I don't think so. I think the reason why I might have thought that in the past is because I didn't really like fully analyze the system, right? It's just kind of like, okay, I'm going to put a little bit of thought into it. But what if I spent like years thinking about it, right? All the time. Then I realized like it's a system, right? It's a capitalist system. They have to promote competition because that is a way to bring in more money, right? If you're just like, oh, we're a friendly gym, it's just like a family gym and we're just about people having just fun, and that was actually just it wouldn't survive well in capitalism, right? So you push competition, and competition is easy to turn toxic anyway, even if you don't mean it to be, but I think they don't care. But it just can lend itself to that anyway. And so in a capitalist system, you're using competition and this kind of like race to become the ubermensch to draw even just regular people in, even though they might not want to be competitors, but they want to be around that, right? It is a way to like draw people in. It's like a marketing thing, right? All your competitors also become free publicity for you, right? And so you're getting this consistent population walking in the door all the time, every month, right? So now my percentage of developing people doesn't have to be that high because if it's like, I'm struggling, whoever I get, I got to make them all good. Okay, now you got to be a good teacher. But if it's always rotating through, I don't actually have to be that good, right? Then out of the people that stay because they like my system or they're durable because they don't get hurt or whatever, then I just have to be good for the ones that stay, that stick with it, that filter through all the sorting mechanism, right?
Yeah. So that makes me think of like John Danaher, right? So John Danaher is this jujitsu coach, and he's notorious because he had a bunch of students that were really good, and are perhaps arguably too many that were too good at competition to be coincidental, or like that he has to be a good teacher for that many students to be good. But it's like, I don't know, because it's like I would think that you would know. Like I've watched Danaher videos and I've been like underwhelmed. It was a lot of talking. It was a lot of words.
A lot of people bring him up. The problem with it is he's been around for a very, very, very long time. Like, so I started jujitsu back in the 90s and he was around even like back then, right? So people only know about him in the last like 5 years, but they don't know the whole history of this guy. And so when he came in, he was like the first one with any academic pedigree.
Right.
He was like, a teaching assistant in philosophy. So he just like
Ooh.
brought in that type of like
verbiage.
Yeah, yeah. So everybody's like, this guy's smart, right? Because he's bringing that philosophical like syllogism, right? Like this kind of like, if this, then that.
Yes.
He was like, I'm going to create a grad student kind of program for jujitsu.
Okay.
So that was a big paradigm shift because He was kind of doing an Ayn Rand Atlas Shrugged revolt against the current system because even for the reactionaries at the time, they were just like, jujitsu should be for ordinary people, regular people. And Danaher was like, no, it shouldn't be.
Uh huh.
It should be gated and only for the elite, for people who could dedicate their whole lives to this. And not for beginners, but for people who already have advanced knowledge.
Right.
So he made it even more toxic and gatekeeping, right?
Yes.
Even the chuds back then thought, wait a minute, that's like too much, man. What about like the kids or hobbyists? That he's like, fuck them all. And so if you go back and listen to like stuff from 10 years ago and you listen to like Farhaz Zahabi or Dave Camarillo, these people who were like going to these classes, they would like talk about Danaher being the biggest asshole because he didn't want to answer any beginner questions. He didn't want to even like waste his time with beginners or new people or people who weren't getting things quickly.
Selection. It's a selection program.
So his sorted, right? Basically, you weren't invited here. You don't belong here if you don't get it right away, right? And so who were the people that went there? None of them were like homegrown. He didn't have time for you. He only had time for people who were already to a certain level. So then all these people who were the best at their own schools came to him. If he thought you were slow, he didn't have time for you. And on top of that, if you didn't have money, he didn't have time for you because part of building that relationship with him is about taking lots of private lessons with him, which he charges an arm and a leg. So for him to even pay attention to you in class, you better have had a relationship with him over the years where you paid tens of thousands of dollars in private lessons. So you're buying his attention. So he's applying academia with anarcho-capitalism. It's Atlas Shrugged. So he just had a very, very strict sorting system that only allowed for like, first of all, people who were like homeschooled or who had unlimited time.
Resources.
Yeah, a lot of resources, who were young, very durable so that they could train all the time. Also, people who would prioritize training above everything else, including even the lives of others. Like his students were training during the lockdown, when there was no vaccine, when we didn't fully understand COVID. And whether they killed family members or not, they kept training. So it also sorted for a very unhealthy and awful set of people. The kind of people who come out of Ivy League education and become war criminals. It's also why they had such a head start and advantage over people after the pandemic, right? People knew Danaher and his squad, but they really knew them after the pandemic because they had such an advantage. They had such a head start because they kept training when other people didn't. The Death Squad, right, as they're called, yeah, that's them. It's not even tongue in cheek. That's their attitude. That's their homage. I don't know how much more explicitly they can make it. I mean, they've made it explicit before. And so that sorting process took a long time. If it was just about homegrown, you would have heard about him a long time ago because he had enough time to bring up white belts. No, it took him that long to sort through enough people and also create a reputation where more people who were already good started showing up to him. A lot of it thanks to fellow weeb George St. Pierre. And then that's why it's like a 25-year, 20-year project where he finally started producing all these people who were good. And then you put them in a room together and they all tell you they rolled all the time. Like most of what they did was rolling. So you put them in a room together, you train all the time. This is like kind of like the history of American Kickboxing Academy. They recruited for like the best wrestlers, taught them some kickboxing, and then just had them spar all the time. And they like were the top team for the longest time. So it's all about that recruiting process. You know, he's from a university, so he understands like how universities are all about not developing athletes, but it's about recruiting. I mean, there's some people who still believe Harvard or other Ivy League institutions develops people, and that's why they're privileged. When in reality, it just sorts for the people who are already privileged. In fact, it's sourced for the 0.001% of the most privileged. So yeah, it's not a coincidence. It's highly orchestrated and manipulated. And so Danaher brought that to jiu-jitsu.
Yeah, and that makes sense because it looks like something special that he's doing, but in fact, it's a 25-year program of weeding out almost everybody until you get people that are optimized for no gi competition.
I mean, even listen, you talk about this project, right? It sounds like eugenicism. And then you listen to some of his interviews that he talks about how like these are not good people, but and then he starts talking about like the Nazis.
Yeah. Yeah.
I don't think he even puts a caveat before fetishizing Imperial Japan. So we talked about positionality. You and I have a positionality, and so does he, and so does his squad.
Well, that's fascinating because we just broke down something that looks like good teaching, but in fact, it's the worst teaching. It's, from my perspective, I've always believed that teaching is like, and some of the theory behind this, the educational theory behind this, actually is most developed from the Soviet Union, Vygotsky and some other educational theorists. But it's like you take someone from where they are to somewhere to a greater point of knowledge.
You don't want to fail any student.
Yeah, like everybody gets more than they had before.
Yeah, he's all about failing as many students as he can until he finds the ones that he thinks have potential.
And that's the American approach, right? Everything is competitive. I remember like I'm old enough that like reality TV didn't exist when I was a kid, and the first one was Survivor. But like after Survivor, there was like tons, and every program was like you start with a number of people, and then you eliminate people, and you eliminate people, and then somebody wins at the end. And it was like gradually every single show on TV became an elimination program. And yeah, like my educational philosophy, like as a teacher, is like that's just so perverse and wrong. Like that's not what I believe a teacher should be doing, because that's not teaching.
When you come to the US, a term you'll hear all the time or a saying you'll hear all the time in every venue is survival of the fittest. It could be at work, at school, in sports, just regular conversations. And Americans and America will just say that all the time, which speaks to that mentality that you're talking about.
Yeah. Canada is in many ways the same as the States, but I can't, I know the phrase, but like it's not something I hear every day. Yeah. So teaching is something that it's the only way I've ever like made a living, really. So I have continuously thought about it for my whole life. And like my inability to get really good at martial arts has been kind of like a fascinating thing to me, because I've gotten good at most things that I've done, but not this.
Yeah. So let's not blame the victim, right? So let's talk about some of the curriculums you've been under in martial arts.
Taekwondo was so long ago, but I remember a lot of exercise, a lot of stretching, a lot of running, a lot of aerobics, jumping jacks, kicks and kicking bags, and then a little bit of sparring. That's what I remember. Kalari Payat was more like learning dance, because it's like everything was pre-sequenced. There's no free sparring that I ever did. I know that warriors, I'm sure, did that when they were trying to, fight each other as champions. But like what we learn as students is like prearranged sequences with different weapons. And that was like easy and fun. And, the exercise, like the stances are really low. So it's like different muscles. It's a different way of moving. I liked it a lot. It was cool, but like your whole emphasis on like freedom and play, it's not really there in Kalari. It's much more like it's almost more like meditative. You come, you do your exercises. Jeet Kune Do was pretty, I guess the instructor can make that what they want, but the approach at the gym I went to was very, very playful and very free. And, it was good. I had a good time there. But like where I never got good was judo and jujitsu. And those are just, my experience in judo is just like, you learn these throws and you learn them, you drill them, and then they're just like, okay, now go fight. And then you go fight and nothing that you learned works. And jujitsu is not that different. It's roughly the same experience. So what gives, Sam? Why is that?
So it sounds like the other arts that you did, right? The non judo jujitsu arts were like more like conditioning based, exercise based. It's a lot of like getting a workout. Getting good at it is about how good a shape you're in,
Yeah,
which are pivotal to judo and jujitsu also. But judo and jujitsu, from what you're saying, is more like you drill and then you go fight. And that's it.
yeah,
It's like much more simple.
yeah,
And either that works for you or it doesn't.
yeah.
And it sounds like it hasn't been working out for you too well.
Well, yeah, just I don't know, but for me, it's very frustrating.
You were supposed to quit. That's the point, because obviously this wasn't for you. And then some young person was supposed to replace you and they were supposed to get good. If you love the Southpaw Project, become one of our financial supporters. It'll help us supplement the cost of running this project, the incredible time and energy we put into it 7 days a week, and you'll be giving us some breathing room, not only to juggle Southpaw with our day jobs, but also to expand Southpaw into other areas. We can't exist without your contributions. Show your Southpaw solidarity by supporting us at southpawpod.com.
And I did quit. I quit so many times and then I keep going back, right? I just keep quitting and I keep going back. But like with math, in my life, I've had these moments, or even with languages, like there's a moment with a language where like you go from like, you're just like frustrated and you're beating your head against the wall and you're super frustrated. And then all of a sudden, like people are talking and you understand them and you start saying stuff and you didn't know you had that in you. And that's the moment I'm waiting for still. I'm still waiting for that with grappling.
Well, the grappling sparring, right? The stakes are much higher because you could actually get hurt.
Yeah.
So that's something I addressed right away, right? The stress is what prevents us from improving faster. So to do something about eliminating the stress, it's so much easier to get good at something.
Yeah, it's so stressful. It's so stressful. I'm so afraid. I'm so afraid of getting injured. I'm so afraid.
And it's not imagined, right? You can get hurt. Like you're just in the gym and somebody will scream and you're like, uh-oh, something happened, right?
I've been a month off because I injured my rib. My floating rib was slipped. And it's a painful one.
So you mentioned this before, right? Because you are talking about a lot of like atrocities, genocide right now, and you're getting injured sometimes doing this thing, but you keep coming back to it, right? So there's something about it where it must give you something else, right? It's like fun. It's like, I don't know if escape is the right thing, but you could use that same curiosity and kind of investigative parts of you. So you could use the same skills that you use for politics, but you could do it in a way where you're like, okay, I don't have to use these skills in just things that make me feel bad. I can also use it for things that make me feel curious and fills me with wonder, right? It seems like that's what you're getting out of it, which is why you keep going back to it. I think the stress in jujitsu in a way is good for you insofar as like, because there's a sense of urgency. So you literally cannot think about anything else, right? Whatever you were doing before, whatever you were covering Israel, whatever, you got to leave it at the door, because if you think about anything else, you actually can get hurt really bad. So it doesn't allow you to think about anything else.
Yeah, and like judo's even faster. It's like you're just gonna get thrown.
So you got to be there. Your mind can't be wandering. So something I wanted to talk to you about also with regards to politics and martial arts. I think the politics around martial arts is about power, power to dominate others and the power to resist the power of others. Even among radicals who like martial arts, they're not often aware that power is not just any one thing. It's not flat and all the same. I think a lot of radicals flatten it into Western dualism and the binary of good and bad. And so all authority is the same, all power is the same. But like how power plays out in martial arts, the power of a state to dominate other countries and the power of a state to resist that domination are not the same. I would say your analysis of politics is an analysis of power. And from that analysis, not all power or authority is equal. And the US uniquely has power and authority over everyone else. It is the ultimate power and authority rather than just another power like the rest. So, for our listeners, can you explain what makes U.S. world power and authority so different and unique?
So this is why, like, I'm not against empires, and I use empire in the singular. It's not just America. Like, the empire includes Canada, it includes the UK, especially. It includes Australia and New Zealand. They have a special word for it, the Five Eyes, right? And Europe, they have a special word for it, which is the West.
It's a web.
Everybody knows what the West is, but nobody can like say it without making some kind of racialist statement, because that's the foundation. And so I've been studying the history and kind of going through it in the historical podcast, but like the empire, the Anglo-American empire, that's the way I would categorize it. And I would say I'd start it sometime in the 1700s, and I would say it continues, and it's continuous. Like, England didn't have a revolution and overthrow their elites, right? Like, that structure of England is the same as it was, um, hundreds of years. And like same with same with America. They have a constitution that's 100 and 250 plus years old, right? To go through the history is like to go through a history of Britain gradually taking over India and getting the rights to collect revenue from India and plundering India and taking over the slave trade from like Portugal and Spain prior to that. And that's why they had the wealth to go and embark on this India project. And then India, and plundering India and having India to continuously plunder for centuries, gave them the power to take over the much of the rest of the world. And then after World War II, there's this kind of transfer of the whole imperial project, locus of the project, from the United Kingdom to the United States. And like, all of these things are specific dates and everything. But today, the consequence today is military power, firepower, military bases, and financial arrangements, resource flows, all are not those of a world of countries. So like, we're all taught this theory that there's 180 countries, and like maybe certain countries have wealth and others don't. But it's like, that doesn't tell the story. The story is actually one of continuous flows of wealth from the poor countries to the rich countries, from hundreds of countries to the rich countries. And within a country like America or Canada, there's a flow of these same kinds of earth resources from native reserves in Canada, or, poor communities, Black community, native reserves in America too. And there's these internal flows and colonialism is that. Colonialism is a flow of resources from the poor to the rich. And that flow is like very biased and very unidirectional, and it's a global system. That's why I say empire and not empires. And like, that's why I think people make a mistake analytically when they think of Russia as a rival empire, or even China as a rival empire. And you can do a kind of an economic analysis of like how the resources flow.
And has flowed historically, right? You can't just catch up like in a generation, right? I think especially with China, a lot of that money came from the US, because like the US often complains, hey, we're buying all our stuff from China. So where do you think China got all their money from, right? Because it didn't have this history of like this flow of money from everywhere else.
Exactly. And so the future is interesting, because before the 1700s, I mean, Spain and Portugal destroyed the Americas in the 1500s. But like, before the 1700s, the Asian economies were the biggest economies in the world and the most advanced economies in the world. China and India and the whole, like Asia writ large. And that process of drain and destruction, starting with the Americas and plunder, and then going to Asia and Africa, those processes are, I believe, starting to reverse and starting to go back to the pre 1700s pattern. Obviously, if you're a Western supremacist, it's not a good thing.
So to summarize a little bit to the listeners, what you're saying is empire, colonialism, this type of unique power is not just about like who's powerful now, but you also have to take in the history, this history of flow of resources. So there has to be a history involved with it as well.
And recent history, like the past few hundred years specifically. And if you understand the recent history, then you understand a lot about, so like racist doctrine is also part of empire. It's part of colonialism, and it's part of the way that they rewrote world history about 150 years into their conquest for world domination. A bunch of people from England and America and then Germany wrote a set of theories about why they conquered the world and why it was inevitable that they were going to conquer the world. And it didn't have to do with stolen wealth and technology and knowledge from Asia, primarily in indigenous civilizations. It was this racial theory that they wrote. And a lot of that is still like, people still believe that.
It was like a good guy, bad guy narrative, right?
Yeah. And like this, and it's Darwinian. It's like Darwinian. They kind of took the biology of Darwin and they said, oh, okay, we must be the fittest because we took over the world. And so biological racism, which is like late 19th century, early 20th century, it's like people think of that as a discredited doctrine, but it's like it's still embedded in a lot of academic work, and it's still embedded in a lot of the way people think.
It's still playing out.
Yeah, it's still playing. Like there was a guy, I don't think there's a guy, one of Trump's picks is like the guy with a Christian crusader tattoo on his chest, and he was like screaming about Western civilization. And I was like, this is early 20th century racial theory that we're getting. And the way that they write the history to say like, there was once upon a time, there was ancient Rome and ancient Greece, and now America is the heir to that. Like, like that's a weird, we talked about the weird rewriting of history of martial arts, but like this is way beyond that.
So it's not just the flow of resources and wealth, and it's not just about power, but also the West is uniquely dangerous, right? You're talking about this type of thinking, this dangerous thinking that comes out of the West.
Exactly. And like America, like people talk about like the threats to American interests. Like think of this phrase, like American interests in the region, where they're like, China's threatening American interests in the region. Why does America have interests in the region? Like, why does that, how does that make sense? That shouldn't be. Or like France, why is France a guarantor of the ceasefire in Lebanon? Like, what does France have to do with that? What business is it of theirs? Or like Israel itself, right? It's like Eastern European people under American, Anglo-American sponsorship are sent weapons that are made in America to drop on Arabs who live there. It's that's empire, right?
Actually, I wanted to get into that also because I think listeners understand like a lot more about Palestine and its history. And they also know Israel would not exist without the backing of the US. And like you said, like the US is not just the US, right? It also represents all these other countries that are part of its web. So why is the US so invested in Israel and its expansion projects?
Oh man, that's such a great question. And it's such a point of dispute, even among people who study it all day. So there's several different hypotheses, and none of them to me are entirely adequate. So there's, of course, the lobby hypothesis, right? Which is John Mearsheimer and Stephen Walt. And so the notion is there's a very powerful lobby that gives money so that the American Republican electoral system renders them vulnerable to lobbying, which of course, none of these things, nothing I'm going to say is not true, even when it contradicts. Even I'm going to give you several theories. They're full of true things and they contradict each other. So the electoral system renders the American system vulnerable to people who give money to politicians. There's money in politics, and the money is used very methodically by this lobby to make sure that politicians from all parties are pro-Israel. And so that's one of the reasons why American politics is super pro-Israel, because they cover their bases, they're very well organized, and they have a way of making sure that every politician is on their side. And if you're not on their side, they can destroy you through primary, whatever, all the lobby kind of machinations and media machinations that they can do. So that's one of the theories. Another one is that Israel is, so that's like the lobby theory. Then there's the outpost theory, which is like Israel is performing really useful functions for the American empire in the Arab world. So like everywhere in the world, there's some outpost that America uses to try to attack and try to maintain chaos and disorganization and disorder and their ability to grab resources. So in Eastern Europe, that's Ukraine right now. In China, or in East Asia, that's Taiwan. And in the Middle East, it's Israel. So there's always some proxies, or one or more. Like the US has also Jordan, they have Egypt, they have Saudi Arabia, although Saudi Arabia is a little shaky nowadays. But they have these countries that are where the elites are loyal to them. And because the elites are loyal to them, they can use those countries as a basis to continuously just keep the potentially independently developing countries that might want control of their own resources or might want a different world order that isn't dominated by America. Keep those countries divided, disorganized, continuously having to defend themselves from frequent wars and so on. So obviously Israel is doing that. It is hard to say that Israel is not doing that. The lobby hypothesis, people say that Israel costs America money, which is of course true, but it's not exactly about money, right? It's about keeping everybody down. And does Israel help keep them down in the Middle East? Oh yeah, it does.
Is oil one of the hypotheses also?
Yeah, I'd say oil is like part of the outpost hypothesis because there's oil there. But like, I'm not a big resource. I don't really think in terms of specific resources because the empire existed when the big resource was slaves, right? And the slaves were growing sugar, and then they were growing cotton. And like, if you look at like Eduardo Galeano's book, The Open Veins of Latin America, he talks about like the exploitation of Bolivia. And Bolivia used to be a silver place before it was a tin place. And Venezuela used to be a superpower of cacao, before it was an oil place. So the particular resources change, but the imperial relationship and the relationship of colonialism and the flow of those resources doesn't change. So the Middle East is important because it's oil, but the Middle East is important mainly because a unified Arab nation would be an independently developing nation that wouldn't be sending oil in this case, but like whatever, everything they have wouldn't be drained to the West the way that it is.
So they're also thinking about the future, not just the present.
Yeah, exactly. And like their own documents, the way that the English wrote about this, English imperialists from the 20th century wrote about this. They were like, we are destined to dominate the world forever, and this is our evil plan for world domination. It was very explicit. It's very explicitly written out. And even up till World War II, like there's a famous memo from George Kennan where he talks about this, right? He's like, we have 50% of the world's wealth or whatever, and we're 6% of the world's population. And to maintain this situation, we're going to have to do all these things. And here's how we're going to do it.
What's funny is Western Orientalism always talks about like China is thinking 10,000 years ahead, right? They're planning that far. Or like during World War II, they're like Japan plans for like thousands of years, right? But in reality, it's like the US is planning that far ahead so that it can maintain its rule forever.
Yeah. Yeah. And they're panicking because the world doesn't really respond to that.
The world doesn't like that.
Yeah, like other human beings don't like that. Other human beings don't necessarily believe that Americans are some kind of, or Israelis are some kind of superior race. And but also like literally like in terms of chaos theory or like physical realities, like you can't make a plan for a society that's too far ahead. Like it's all too dynamic.
So touching upon some of the stuff that you mentioned, we know about Israel and Palestine, but I think we're far less educated about Israel and Lebanon and why Israel wants Lebanon. Could you briefly explain that for us, what Israel wants with Lebanon?
Absolutely. So the simplest thing is the idea of greater Israel. Okay. So the idea when Zionists were designing their colonial project in, starting in the first Zionist Congress of 1906 and Theodor Herzl, the idea was potentially at least Israel from one river to the other. So the Israeli flag, right? It has these two stripes. So one is the Nile River, which is currently in Egypt, and the Euphrates River, which is currently in Iraq. And so the borders of Greater Israel are meant to include a lot of Saudi Arabia, a lot of Lebanon, um, all of Jordan, lots of Iraq, lots of Egypt, parts of Turkey, lots of Syria. That's what Greater Israel is in their minds. It's supposed to be huge, and so they want to. Their idea ultimately is to ethnically cleanse all of those lands and control all of those lands and fill them. It's all colonialism is also always a demographic engineering project. So they want to demographically engineer their way to more Jewish people and get rid of the Arab population of that region. So that's one simple reason is that. Another reason, in if you're not like a greater Israel person, which more of them are than you would think, or than they would admit, the other reason is this kind of there's like a logic of settler states where to protect one thing you have to take the next thing. So that's like Lebanon. If you look at a relief map, as a lot of people did during this war for the first time, Lebanon is for the most part higher than Israel. So from Israel's perspective as like the godlike colonialists and colonizers in this region, they want to be looking down on the natives. They don't want the natives looking down on them. So they want to take these mountain heights and be able to look down on the natives. And it kind of upsets them that, on the border with Lebanon, there are higher points from which the Lebanese can observe them and their movements and their plans. So whether it's like a security logic or a greater Israel logic, those are some of the reasons why Israel will never leave Lebanon alone. The same way that, they won't leave Syria alone. The only reason they leave Jordan alone is because Jordan is entirely under the thumb of the Americans and won't do a thing that doesn't support them. And Egypt, again, is a complicated story, but Egypt is also being sort of bribed and coerced into not interfering with anything Israel does.
So to close it out, I wanted to end with politics in martial arts, because I feel like this is all related because we're talking about power politics. And also how we deal with all these ugly things happening in the world, right? And for us, like martial arts is a way of channeling some of that. So we've talked about how reactionary martial arts culture in the West is, and in particular BJJ. Same is true for MMA. But at the same time, as far as the embodied practice and the movement arts, whether BJJ or MMA, it's very inclusive. The culture sure isn't, but the open endedness of BJJ and MMA allows any body to find a style that works for them and affords any body to navigate them. This is why in MMA or BJJ, everyone's style is so unique and specific. In the same BJJ school, everyone will do things differently. So, despite the chuds, that embodied practice and embodied exploration can't be denied. I think when you message me sometimes about an MMA thing, it's always about the matchup and about like how these two very different things will play out, right? So, we are talking about that open endedness and how two different people can move in very different ways. So, with that said, how do you get BJJ to work for you?
I guess because I had like a very wrestling oriented teacher, I find usually I can get to top where I usually end up with most opponents is top closed guard. And then I'm sort of stuck there, but so are they. and,
Hey, that's a strategy, right? Stalemate.
yeah, they have the frustration of like I have pretty good balance, so they can't do a sweep, and I'm pretty good at defending the obvious attacks from there. But I have a really hard time passing because usually they'll just kind of disengage and move back, and I won't be able to pass. So that's usually most of my matches are I'm in top closed guard. And people who roll with me criticize me for several specific things which are like very on brand. They're just like you're not aggressive. It's like you're not really trying to win. You don't really ever go for submissions. You're sort of happy to get into either a neutral or a top position, but then you don't do anything with it. You overthink and you don't execute, and etc. And I'm sort of like, yeah, these are all. None of those things are why I do martial arts. So I'm, I'm not trying to dominate. I'm not trying to win. I don't want to. I don't like hurting. I don't like even the possibility that I might hurt somebody, which is kind of strange for someone to say if they're into martial arts.
These are the quandaries that we radicals face in martial arts. Right?
Yeah, yeah,
This is like, oh, this is great. And then at the same time, it's like, what are we doing here? Why am I doing this?
yeah. Like I would get yelled at, like, why don't you go for a submission? And I'd be like, oh, go for a submission, but then I might hurt this person. Why would I do that?
This is what I was talking about, right? Different types of power. They're asking you to have power to dominate others. And you're like, I just want power to not be dominated.
Yeah, exactly. I'm quite satisfied.
And this is what we're talking about in the world stage, right?
Yes.
You can't compare different powers the same way. One power is trying to dominate. You have another power trying not to be dominated. Just because they both happen to be some type of like formalized structure does not mean they are the same.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. And it's always a mistake. And this is why like Asian culture and Western culture, even like in terms of political culture, foreign policy, or like even military policy, they are different. They are different.
There is a projection that the West does.
Yeah.
Part of why Americans think countries like the DPRK or China are so authoritarian is because they project our police and military and resource rich infrastructure onto these countries. But these countries don't have the same number of cops, the same militarized cops. They don't have the same manpower. They don't have the same money. They don't have the same number of military bases or the same military reach and might and personnel or carte blanche. Really, only the US has military bases all around the world, ships all around the world. So, yeah, if you put the US police presence into those countries, then I guess they can assert all sorts of authority. They have all that authority, but they don't have that presence.
They don't.
And they don't want that presence. So, that big brother presence of cops around every corner, driving around every block and neighborhood, watching you, that only exists here. They just think, oh, it's all must be the same. It's like the way it is here is there, but except they're bad. Again, back to what we were talking about, this like good guy, bad guy narrative, flattening everything down into this like Western dualism, this like Cartesian dualism that we could even break down, right? If we're thinking about like bodily movements and like these embodied practices, this mind body dualism, right? These are not the ways like non Western countries think about things, right? And also, it's not accurate about how the world works. It's not in these binaries. It's not this like dualism. It's not this black, white, flattened earth. The world has dimensions. So I think, for me, maybe for you, martial arts is like kind of an embodied practice where I get to explore all that gray and all that capriciousness and all that, murkiness, right? Which this murkiness, like talking to indigenous wrestlers, martial artists, and thinking about like Confucianism, Taoism, and even like listening to other philosophies not from the West, right? A lot of it is just like the world is not orderly and it's just messy. Whereas going back to eugenicism and Nazi world order, white supremacist world order, again, world order, right? It's always supposed to be this purified, orderly thing. And for things to be ordered like that, you have to have a certain type of authority, which is very different from authority that views the world as being murky and capricious and messy.
So what's your grappling style?
Wait and see. I often let people grab me first, and then I let them keep the grips. So essentially, I let them initiate. This is also true to my striking as well. So I don't have to grab them. They could grab me. I don't have to initiate for the initiation to begin. So once they grab me, two becomes one. So in their mind, they think they have me. So I go where they go. But really, now that two has become one, they go where I go too. It's mutual. So I often let them exert most of the muscular force. And I just shape myself and place myself in a position where I have more movement options than they do. So for example, if you grab my arm with both of your arms and pull me towards you, you're also pulling me on top of you. So if I don't resist and I go with you and I just shape myself to be perpendicular to you, rather than you getting behind my back, I land on top of you in a pin. So I just try to conserve energy and be the best shapeshifter I can be. So rather than butting heads and turning it into American football, I turn it into rock, paper, scissors. You show me an aggressive rock and I just turn into paper.
That's a lot of skill though, because like I just get scared and I stiffen up and I just try to hold the person far away.
So this is where we get back to play, right? If this is my first time in that exchange, I don't know what will happen. I don't know what the risks are. But if I just play and explore those areas and see what the risks are and see what could happen, then I've mapped out the territory, which then allows me room to explore possible solutions. That's where confidence comes from. Confidence doesn't just come from like ego or like self-belief based on nothing. It comes from like, oh, I've already mapped this out, so I know the map now. Then you're confident in your read of the map instead of your confidence in yourself.
Just having seen it before is key.
That's why I don't drill. I just do these games because what's most important is reads, getting as many reads as possible. Once you have enough reads, then you feel safe and secure. Then you can really move the way you want to instead of moving in a way that's shaped by your anxieties. And I think that's how all of us want to move and exist in the society, right?
All the time.
All the time, right? Not feeling like this anxiety, right? Not feeling like you don't know what's going to happen. Feeling like it's a mess, but I can read the terrain. This was a great conversation, Justin.
Thanks, man.
Thank you for your time. I really appreciate it.
Thanks for inviting me.
If you like this episode and like what we do, support us on Patreon. We also have the Liberation Martial Arts program if you want to train with us from wherever you are. What you're learning is how to teach yourself. It's also an approach you can take with you into the world. Sponsors get a monthly training session with me, either in person or online. You can also sponsor the training of an organizer instead, or support our training organizer program or me directly. Find all our links, including Southpaw merch, at southpawpod.com. With that said, thanks for listening.